Hey everyone, welcome to another webinar. Today we're going to be talking about muscles and muscle tissue, and it's a very long chapter, so we're only going to cover about, I think, the first, 10 or 15 pages in your book, and that corresponds to the first 20 slides in this presentation, and then next time we'll talk about the rest. And we might even have to break it into a total of 3 parts. We'll see. But here we go. So the first goals for this very first section of this presentation are for you guys to be able to compare and contrast the 3 basic types of muscle tissue. Compare and contrast the 3 basic types of muscle tissue. So what are they? Skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle tissue. And by the end of these next few slides, you should be able to list all the similarities between the 3 and then the differences between the 3. Also, you should be able to list 4 important functions of muscle tissue. There are more than 4, but there are 4 big ones. So we'll talk about some of those. Okay, so before we really dive in, you guys need to learn a little bit of terminology. The first thing is what a muscle fiber is. So the word fiber in this case is a synonym for a skeletal or a smooth muscle cell. So there are skeletal muscle fibers and smooth muscle fibers. And these are, in this instance, fiber is a synonym for cell. This is the case because skeletal and smooth muscle cells are very elongated. Okay? So they look like fibers. So when I say muscle fiber, I'm referring to a muscle cell, usually a skeletal muscle cell, but also possibly a smooth muscle cell. Skeletal muscle cells are very long, and these fibers or cells can be but between 1 and 2 feet long in some of our longer muscles, like the sartorius muscle. Also, know the prefixes myo and sarco. Both of these mean muscle. So you might see words like sarcoplasm, sarcolemma, myoglobin, things like that. It just means muscle. So sarcoplasm is the cytoplasm in a muscle fiber, in a muscle cell. Sarcolemma is the plasma membrane of a muscle cell. And we'll talk about those more when we come across them. All right, so let's talk about now the 3 muscle tissue types. The first being skeletal muscle. These are the longest of the 3 muscle tissue types. The cells are, and that's one of the reasons why these cells are called muscle fibers. They are striated. That is a unique identifying feature. Cardiac muscle is also striated, so that's a similarity that they share. But skeletal muscle is striated. And what that means is there are these striations, hopefully you can see my mouse pointer, between dark and light bands. And these striations are running perpendicular to the muscle fibers themselves. And they're actually showing some of the smaller contractile components that we'll talk about later. But it's striated, that's important. That tells you a lot about what mechanism it uses to contract, as we will see further along. So skeletal muscle tissue is the only type of muscle under conscious control, so we call it voluntary muscle. Sometimes it functions involuntarily through the use of reflexes, but it is the only muscle that can contract voluntarily that we can consciously make contract. So that is a unique identifying feature. Also, it is very powerful. It is the most powerful of the muscle tissue types. However, it is easily fatigued. So you can think about how quickly your muscles fatigue when you're lifting weights, or even if you're running, especially if you're not in great shape. And contrast that to your heart, which has to function 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all the time, and it never fatigues. So that's another unique identifying feature. Very powerful, easily fatigued. Also, it is highly adaptable. This is another unique feature of skeletal muscle. It can be controlled. The strength of contraction can be graded. So it can be a very small contraction to lift a paperclip, say, or very graded very highly or produce a very powerful contraction to lift something very heavy. All right, the next tissue type is cardiac muscle. So like skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle is striated. However, unlike skeletal muscle, it is involuntarily controlled. Involuntarily controlled. So we cannot consciously, at least most of us cannot consciously control our heart. Some people can regulate their heart rate consciously. Still, however, I wouldn't go as far to say is that's voluntary control. Some people might, I don't know, but basically, essentially, it's involuntarily controlled. We have no control. We can't force our heart to contract. Heart muscle, cardiac muscle tissue is connected by intercalated discs, which are specialized gap junctions that link the cytoplasms of all of the cardiac muscle cells together. That will be very important when we learn more about cardiac muscle tissue in the heart chapter. Another unique feature is that cardiac muscle can contract without any nervous system input. It beats or contracts automatically at a set rate set by our heart's pacemaker, the SA node. And we won't get into that in this chapter, but we will later, next quarter. And this node paces the heart with or without input from the nervous system. The autonomic nervous system can adjust our heart rate, but it doesn't actually innervate the tissue and force it. It doesn't give the signal to contract, say, 60 times per minute. So that's definitely a unique feature. It can contract without any nervous system input. The third and final type of muscle tissue is smooth muscle tissue. This is found in the walls of our hollow organs, like our stomach, our intestines, our urinary bladder. It contracts to move things along, to propel food along, to force urine out of our body. These cells are elongated like skeletal muscle cells, however, they're not nearly as long, but they are elongated. Big difference here between this type of muscle tissue and the other two is that there are no striations. So when you look at this, it looks like you see lines, right? But those are the elongated cells themselves. And remember that the striations are actually perpendicular to the cells, to the axis of the cells. And we don't see any alternating dark and light bands. It's all roughly sort of just one color. All right, so no striations. That means it's going to contract using a different mechanism from skeletal and cardiac muscle. Like cardiac muscle, smooth muscle is involuntarily controlled. It is, however, innervated by the nervous system and contracts when the nervous system tells it to. This type of muscle produces very slow and sustained contractions, which is in contrast to the other two types, which are usually short, powerful contractions, and then they rest. Okay, so there's 4 special characteristics of muscle tissue that allow it to perform its many functions. So the first one is excitability. What that means basically is that it can respond to a stimulus. So a nerve sends a stimulus, which is called an action potential, to the muscle, and then the muscle can then respond by creating its own action potential, which will cause contraction. But we will get into that later as well. For now, just know that excitability is the ability of muscle tissue to respond to a stimulus. The second important characteristic of muscle tissue is that it demonstrates contractility, which means that it can shorten its length. So the cell can actually shrink and shorten its length. Again, very, very important. That's what allows our muscles to produce movement. A third important feature of muscle tissue is that it is extensible. So this is sort of the opposite of contractility, in that muscles can lengthen passively. So we can stretch our muscles. And then the fourth important feature is elasticity, which is the ability of the muscle to return to its original shape after being stretched. So after it undergoes some type of extension due to its characteristic of extensibility, it can return to its original shape due to its characteristic of elasticity. So those 4 features are very important to wrap your head around when we start talking about how muscles function. All right, speaking of muscle function, here's what all our muscles do. The most obvious thing that muscles do is produce movement. That can be movement of our appendages, of our trunk. It can also be movement of our hollow digestive organs when they constrict and propel food along. They produce movement of some kind. All of our muscles. The heart moves blood. Skeletal muscles move the limbs. Smooth muscles move contents of organs, urine, food, things like that. Okay. They also stabilize joints. Skeletal muscles in particular, or I guess only, skeletal muscles only, they stabilize joints. So we learned last week about how the glenohumeral joint relies heavily on its musculotendinous stabilization. Additionally, muscles produce heat. So only I think about, I want to say 40% of ATP, of the energy released from metabolizing ATP goes to movement production. The rest goes to heat generation. So that may seem inefficient, but I think that beats an internal combustion engine. I can't remember the exact numbers, but I want to say an internal combustion engine is closer to 20% movement production and 80% heat generation. Still, though, if that seems inefficient, although it really isn't, it's also a good thing that our muscles aren't 100% efficient because we rely on this heat generation to maintain our high core temperature. So it's actually a good thing that our muscles produce heat. It can be a bad thing if it's hot outside and we're heavily exercising and we can undergo some type of heat exhaustion or heat stroke, I guess is the layman's term for that. Additionally, muscles protect organs. Skeletal muscles, like for instance our abs and trunk muscles, protect a lot of our digestive organs and kidneys. Smooth muscle forms valves, like the ileocecal valve, for example. And it also can constrict our pupils. All right, guys, let's check our understanding. When describing muscle, what does striated mean? So do you guys remember what striated means? Think back to skeletal and cardiac muscle where it has alternating dark and light bands running perpendicular to the axis of the muscle cells. This is formed by the filaments inside of the muscle cells that cause the muscles to contract the way that they are arranged. Versus smooth muscle, which uses a different type of contraction mechanism, has no striations. All right, Andrew is... I just changed the names. I took these questions out of the book, but anyway, so Andrew is pondering an exam question that asks, which muscle type has elongated cells and is found in the walls of the urinary bladder? If Reed was helping him cheat in class, how would Reed respond? He would say, Andrew, okay, well, first of all, what muscle tissue cells are elongated? Skeletal and smooth. Okay, so far just the first type, the first part of the question, it says that it has elongated cells, so I know it's either skeletal or smooth muscle, and is found in the walls of the urinary bladder. So that would be smooth muscle, right? Because smooth muscle is found in the walls of our hollow organs. So Andrew got that one right. Okay, so the next section, and this gets a little rough. It gets a little tough to visualize, but look at lots of pictures in your book, and I try to include some pretty good ones in this PowerPoint as well. But basically, this next section is going to be looking at the structure and the microscopic anatomy of skeletal muscle. After this section, we'll be talking about the physiology of skeletal muscle, and that gets even rougher. But I think you guys will be fine. I think we'll actually stop after we finish this section. Anyway, so the objectives for this section are to describe the gross structure of a skeletal muscle. Gross meaning just the basic structure, okay, the basic anatomy, not the microscopic anatomy. Okay. The next objective is to describe the microscopic structure and functional roles of the myofibrils, sarcoplasmic reticulum, and the T-tubules of the skeletal muscle fibers. So these are very small structures, but very important structures, and we'll take a look at them in the slides to come. Also, describe the sliding filament model of contraction, and I think that will be our very last thing we cover in this presentation for this week. Okay, so here we go. Let's say that this is our bicep muscle that we cut in half, and now we're looking at a sort of like a cross section here. Every muscle is going to have nerve and blood supply. Usually a muscle has one artery and one nerve that supplies and innervates the entire muscle. And this will go into the muscle, I don't know, somewhere near midway the length of the muscle. A nerve and an artery will enter. Usually there's one or more veins that remove blood and waste and CO2 from the muscle. So muscles are going to be highly vascularized and highly innervated. Okay. Next, we want to talk about these connective tissue sheaths, because the muscle fibers themselves, the muscle cells, don't actually pull on the origins and the insertions. Remember, the origins and the insertions are the parts of the bone that the muscle is attached to. Instead, they're going to pull on this network of connective tissue that ultimately turns into the tendon at either end of the muscle. Okay, so the very outer layer of the muscle is called the epimysium, and this is just a layer of connective tissue that sort of packages, shrink wraps, contains all of the muscle fibers. Deep to that, we're going to have bundles of muscle cells called fascicles. So we can see that here. These are fascicles bundled together. Each one of these is a fascicle. They call it a fasciculus. Each one of these is wrapped and packaged by something called the perimysium. Okay, there's the perimysium. It contains the fascicle. Inside of the fascicle are multiple muscle cells, okay, or fibers. So here we are, muscle fibers. Each one of these is packaged by an endomysium, okay. An endomysium whole packages these fibers, and that's what the fibers pull on when they contract. Just deep to that endomysium would be the actual sarcolemma, or cell membrane of the cells. Anyway, so all of these muscle fibers are packaged here inside of the fascicle, and each individual fiber is wrapped in endomysium. And then if we go even further, we can see that the muscle fibers are packed with myofibrils, which are these contractile units. So they're the actual things that contract in the muscle. Again, though, we'll talk about that in the slides to come. Okay, so this last bullet point here, attachments, refers to how the muscle attaches to the bone. It can be a direct or fleshy attachment, which means the muscle or the flesh itself attaches directly to the bone, to the periosteum. And it's still the connective tissue that's doing it, but the muscle, there's no tendon, basically. An indirect attachment is a tendinous attachment. So all these connective tissue sheaths come together to form a really tough tendon, strong tendon of dense regular connective tissue, and then that is what attaches to the bone.